This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about what happens when a system designed to enforce the law is quietly repurposed to protect power instead. Not loudly, not overnight, but slowly enough that most people never notice the shift until the system begins to turn on itself. What you are watching is not chaos. It is structure under stress. A machine built on loyalty instead of process. A machine that works right up until it doesn't. Because once truth becomes dangerous inside an institution, the institution has only two options. It can absorb the truth, or it can fracture. And when it fractures, it never breaks outward first. It breaks inward, silently. In rooms you will never see, in testimony you were never meant to hear. If you think this is about headlines, stay with me. If you think this is about personalities, don't blink. Because the most important part of this story hasn't happened yet. And by the time it does, the system will already be reacting. Here is the mistake most people make. They think power lives in offices. They think it lives in elections. They think it lives in individuals. It doesn't. Power lives in systems that decide what is seen, what is delayed, and what never surfaces at all. Power lives in the quiet authority to define reality before anyone else can question it. And over time, that authority shifted, not through a coup, not through violence, but through appointments, procedures, norms that stopped being enforced and started being interpreted until enforcement itself became conditional. The system did not ask, is this lawful? It began asking, is this safe? Safe for whom is the key question. Because once an institution measures risk in terms of loyalty rather than legality, its purpose changes without ever announcing that it has changed. It still looks like the same institution. It uses the same language. It issues the same statements. But it no longer answers to the same rules. And when that happens, accountability doesn't disappear. It goes underground, which is where pressure builds. And pressure inside closed systems always finds a release. The most dangerous changes are the ones that feel reasonable at the time. Before, the system moved slowly on purpose. Delay was a safeguard. Silence meant verification. Decisions waited for process, not preference. That friction was not a flaw, it was the point. Now, speed is treated as strength. Statements come early. Conclusions arrive before investigations finish. Internal doubts are framed as disloyalty. Caution starts to look like resistance. And resistance in a loyalty-based system becomes a threat. Nothing dramatic announces this shift. There is no moment where a rule is crossed and alarms go off. Instead, exceptions stack, temporary measures linger. Just this once becomes standard operating procedure. And the system adapts. People learn what is rewarded. They learn what is punished. They learn which truths travel upward and which ones stall out. Over time, the system stops filtering for accuracy and starts filtering for alignment, not because everyone agrees, but because disagreement becomes expensive. That's when the real risk sets in. Because a system trained to suppress friction cannot handle shock. And the shock is coming. Then the system is forced to speak out loud, not by choice, by circumstance. What surfaces first is never the core failure. It's something smaller, concrete, awkward, the kind of thing that sounds personal if you don't know how institutions actually fail. Resources used strangely, authority exercised casually, information released too early or held too long. Individually, these moments look like misjudgments, bad optics, maybe even arrogance. They invite laughter, outrage, dismissal. That reaction is part of the design. Because while attention stays fixed on the surface behavior, the deeper issue remains untouched. The real question is not why this happened, but why nothing stopped it. In a healthy system, multiple breaks engage automatically. Internal checks, external hesitation. quiet corrections before anything reaches daylight. Here, none of that happens. Instead, the behavior continues long enough to be noticed, long enough to generate records, long enough to create witnesses. And once witnesses exist, the system loses control of timing, which is when the danger stops being theoretical, because the next moment won't be small. This is where the mechanism reveals itself. A loyalty-based system does not fail all at once. It redistributes risk, upward protection, downward exposure. Decisions are made at the top, but consequences are absorbed below. Those who benefit are insulated by distance. Those who execute are left holding records. Orders don't arrive as commands. They arrive as expectations, suggestions, assumptions that do not need to be spoken because everyone understands the cost of misunderstanding them. Paper trails thin out. Verbal guidance increases. Responsibility becomes abstract. If something works, credit moves up. If something breaks, accountability moves down. This is not corruption in the cinematic sense. It is far more efficient than that because no one has to break the law outright. They only have to narrow their interpretation of it, just enough to make room for deniability, just enough to keep the system moving until it can't. Because eventually, the people absorbing the risk realize something important. The protection they were promised is conditional, temporary, revocable. And that realization changes behavior. Silence becomes unstable. Loyalty becomes negotiable, which means the system is now running on borrowed time. This is where everything speeds up, not because more happens, but because the margin for error disappears. Questions start coming faster than answers can be shaped. Internal conversations leak into formal settings. Statements that were never meant to be permanent become sworn, recorded, fixed. People stop improvising. They start calculating. Short sentences replace long explanations. Decisions narrow. Options collapse. What used to be handled quietly now has witnesses. What used to be delayed now has deadlines. The system is forced to operate in public while still relying on private rules. That mismatch is fatal, because once a loyalty-based structure is exposed to procedural truth, it has no defense mechanism. It cannot argue process without implicating itself. It cannot deny facts without multiplying them. So it does the only thing it knows how to do. It turns inward. Distance increases, statements contradict each other, authority fragments, and suddenly, the people at the center are no longer being protected by the system. They are being managed by it, which is when survival stops being collective and becomes individual. This is where it reaches you, not abstractly, not theoretically. You feel it when institutions stop behaving predictably, when rules seem to apply differently depending on who is exposed and who is insulated, when outcomes feel pre-decided but explanations arrive late or not at all. You are told to trust the process, but the process no longer looks like process. It looks like improvisation, and that uncertainty changes how people move through their lives. Caution replaces confidence. Rumors fill gaps where clarity used to live. Every decision feels provisional because the system enforcing decisions feels provisional. This is the human cost of internal fracture. Not panic, not collapse, but erosion. Erosion of expectation, erosion of fairness, erosion of the assumption that institutions will still be there tomorrow in the form you recognize today. If this feels unsettling, stay with me. If it feels familiar, don't look away. Because what you're experiencing is not a temporary disruption. It's a signal, and signals don't exist to comfort you. They exist to warn you. This is the moment where it stops being contained. Systems like this don't fail in isolation. They transmit stress. Partners adjust. Counterparts hesitate. Assumptions that once held quietly across borders begin to wobble. When an institution signals that truth is negotiable, everyone watching recalculates. Information sharing slows. Trust thins. Safeguards that depended on mutual confidence start to fray. This isn't ideological. It's mechanical. Markets react to uncertainty. Alliances react to unpredictability. Other systems build redundancy around the possibility that commitments may not hold. And once that happens, reversal becomes difficult because credibility, once questioned, doesn't snap back. It has to be rebuilt slowly, painfully, in public. What was once dismissed as a domestic irregularity now shows up as a variable others have to hedge against. The risk is no longer local, it's systemic, and the system knows it. Which is why the next phase isn't about damage control. It's about trajectory, about where this goes if nothing interrupts it, and whether interruption is still possible. From here, the system has only a few paths left. Not outcomes, paths. The first is adjustment. Quiet correction, internal rules reasserted just enough to stabilize function. Damage acknowledged indirectly. Continuity preserved. This path is slow, technical, and unsatisfying. It requires restraint from people who are already under pressure. The second is erosion. No formal break, no decisive moment, just continued stress without resolution. Authority weakens, compliance becomes selective. The system still operates, but less reliably each time it's tested. This path feels normal until it doesn't. The third is rupture, sudden exposure, forced accountability, public confrontation between truth and authority that cannot be managed quietly. This path is loud, disruptive. And once it begins, it cannot be steered. None of these paths are chosen deliberately. They emerge from accumulated decisions made under constraint, from shortcuts taken when time felt short, from loyalty valued over resilience. What determines the path is not intent. It's timing, and timing is already slipping, which means the question is no longer whether the system changes. It's how abruptly there is a temptation at the end of stories like this to look for resolution, a verdict, a restoration of order that lets everyone exhale and move on. That instinct is understandable. It is also dangerous because systems do not reset when the moment passes. They remember what they were asked to do. They remember what they were allowed to become. And they carry that memory forward, whether or not anyone acknowledges it out loud. What you have been watching is not the collapse itself. It is the exposure of a weakness that has existed for longer than this moment, a weakness that only becomes visible when pressure is applied. The next phase will not announce itself. It will arrive as a series of reasonable decisions that narrow options instead of expanding them, each one defensible, each one incremental. And then, suddenly, the range of outcomes is smaller than anyone expected. If you want to understand what happens next, you can't look away when the tension drops. You have to pay attention to what stabilizes and what doesn't. Because the system is still moving, and the direction it takes will determine whether this was a warning or a rehearsal. Stay with me.